Sensibility, I will be playing Mrs. Henry Dashwood. She is the mother of Eleanor and Marianne and Margaret Dashwood, the Dashwood girls. And I'd like to welcome you to Come Early, sponsored by Wells Fargo Bank. I'm going to spend about 20 minutes approximately talking a little bit, mostly about Jane Austen, a little bit about Sense and Sensibility, after which you will be escorted back into the lobby in time for 30 minutes to curtain, so you can enjoy a cocktail or go outside or do whatever you would like to do. So, Jane Austen was an English novelist whose works of romantic fiction set among the landed gentry earned her a place as one of the most widely read writers in English literature. Her realism, her biting irony, and her social commentary, as well as her acclaimed plots, have gained her historical importance among scholars and critics all over the world. However, for someone whose literary legacy has permeated practically every genre of entertainment and scholarly interest, biographical information on Jane Austen is actually pretty scarce. Only some personal and family letters remain. About 160 out of Austen's 3,000 letters that she wrote in her lifetime to family and friends still exist. Her sister Cassandra, to whom most of the letters were originally addressed, burned the greater part of those letters and censored the ones that she did not destroy. We don't know why, she just did. Other letters were destroyed by the heirs of Jane's brothers. Most of her biographical material was produced after her death and reflects the family's bias in favor of a good, quiet Aunt Jane. So she could have been like rowdy punk rock Aunt Jane, but we don't know because we only have those letters. Jane's parents, George Austen and his wife Cassandra, were members of substantial British gentry families. George was descended from a family of woolen goods manufacturers that had risen through the professions to the lower ranks of the landed gentry. Cassandra was a member of a very prominent titled family. And for much of Jane's life, George Austen served as the rector of 2 Anglican parishes in Hampshire. And he supplemented this income by teaching 3 or 4 boys at a time that also boarded in the Austen home. Jane's immediate family was large. She had 6 brothers: James, George, Edward, Henry, Frank, and Charles. And she had 1 sister, Cassandra, who, like Jane, died unmarried. Cassandra was Jane's closest friend and confidant throughout her entire life, and might hint at why the theme of sisters as best friends is common throughout her work. Jane was born on December 16th in 1775 in Hampshire. After a few months at home, her mother placed her with an Elizabeth Littlewood, a woman who lived nearby, who nursed and raised Jane for about a year, give or take a few months. And then in 1783, according to the family tradition, Jane and her sister were sent to Oxford to be educated by a Mrs. Anne Colley. And they moved with her to Southampton later in that year, but both girls caught typhus, and Jane almost died as a child. So she was sent home to finish her education. In 1785, she was sent to boarding school, again with her sister, where they learned French and spelling and needlework and dancing and music, all of the things that made an accomplished young lady. And all of her biographical information suggests that perhaps they learned dramatics. So I don't know, it sounds like maybe that was questionable. By December 1786, Jane and Cassandra had returned home because the Austen family could no longer afford to send both girls to school, so they were brought back home, and Jane acquired the remainder of her education by reading books guided by her father and her brothers, James and Henry. Apparently, she had an unfettered access to both her father's library and that of a close family friend, and together these collections amounted to a large and varied library about everything. And her father was also tolerant of Jane's writing and provided both sisters with expensive paper and other materials for their writing and drawing and watercolors and all that kind of thing. Park Honan, who is a biographer of Jane Austen, says that the Austen home was lived in an open, amused, easy intellectual atmosphere where ideas of those with whom the Austens might disagree politically or socially were considered and discussed openly. After returning home from school in 1786, she never again lived anywhere beyond the bounds of her immediate family environment. So she visited friends and family, but always came back to the family home. We do know from her letters that survived that the Austen household was lively, and it was full of intellectual and artistic activity. As a matter of fact, private theatricals were also held in the Austen home among friends and family. From when she was about 7 till she was about 13, the family staged a series of plays in the home, including Richard Sheridan's The Rivals and David Garrick's Bon Ton, and other restoration plays, and most of them are comedies. And although details about the production value of these plays do not exist, we do know that most of them were comedies, which suggests one way in which her own comedic and satirical gifts were honed and cultivated. And then probably as early as 1887, Jane began to write poems and stories and plays for her own family's amusement and for her own amusement. She later compiled 29 of these early works into 3 bound notebooks, now referred to as the Juvenilia, volumes 1, 2, and 3. These contain pieces originally written between 1787 and 1793, so she was already writing by the time she was 12. Among these works are satirical novels one satirical novel in letters titled Love and Friendship, in which she mocks the popular novels of sensibility of the time. And I'll talk a little bit about novels of sensibility in a little bit. There's also a 34-page manuscript entitled The History of England, and it's accompanied by 13 watercolor miniatures done by her sister. Her History of England parodies the popular historical writing of the time, particularly a book called The History of England, which was written in 1764. In her own History of England, Jane writes, Henry IV ascended the throne of England much to his own satisfaction in the year 1399, after having prevailed on his cousin and predecessor, Richard II, to resign it to him, and to retire for the rest of his life to Pomfret Castle, where he just happened to be murdered. So, if you know anything about that period in history, it's a very kind of casual way of describing what happened. Austen's juvenilia are often, according to scholar Richard Jenkins, referred to as boisterous and anarchic, and are often compared by many critics to the writing of the 20th century comedy group Monty Python. So it is a tradition of comedy that is very deeply rooted in British history. Sometime in 1789, Jane decided to make stories her central effort, that is, to become a professional writer for profit. And beginning in about 1793, she began to write a more sophisticated work called Lady Susan, which I'm reading right now, actually. It's very interesting. And it's told in a series of letters. And oddly, it's one of the first things that she wrote as a longer project. And her heroine in Lady Susan is considered to be like her most risque, or her most racy of her heroines for that time period. She finished that around 1795, and she began working on a longer novel called Eleanor and Marianne. Her sister later remembers that Eleanor and Marianne was read to the family way before 1796, so this was something that she had been working on. And it was also told through a series of letters. But without the surviving original manuscript, there's no way for us to know how much of that original draft survived in the novel published in 1811 as Sense and Sensibility. So the story goes, anecdotally, the story goes that she started writing this particular story when she was about 18 or 19, put it away in a drawer, like literally put it in a drawer, and then much later took it out again, and her brother is the person that encouraged her to get it published in 1811. Sense and Sensibility was followed by Pride and Prejudice in 1813, Mansfield Park in 1814, Emma in 1815, and posthumously published novels include Northanger Abbey, one of my favorites, and Persuasion, both in 1818, as well as several works of short fiction, poems, plays, collected stories, essays, what have you. Jane died on July 18th in 1817 at the age of 41. Many have speculated as to the cause, but we can't know for sure. What is certain is that early in 1816 she began to feel unwell. Ignoring her illness, she tried to continue to write, but by mid-year her illness became pretty impossible to ignore, and she began a long, slow, and kind of irregular deterioration into sickness that culminated in her death. The majority of her biographers all agree and list her cause of death as something called Addison's disease. And this was done through a retrospective diagnosis in 1964 through letters and documents and stuff like that. However, her final illness also has been described by others as Hodgkin's lymphoma. Others claim that it was bovine tuberculosis, something that is associated with drinking unpasteurized milk. And still others say that it could have been something called Brill-Zinsser disease, and that's a recurrent form of typhus, which, if you recall, she had as a child and almost died. Her brother Henry, through his clerical connections, arranged for his sister to be buried in the north aisle of the nave of Winchester Cathedral. The epitaph, composed by her brother James, praises Austen's personal qualities, expresses hope for her salvation, mentions the extraordinary endowments of her mind, but does not explicitly mention her amazing achievements as a writer. And in her life, that was how it was for the most part. Published anonymously, Jane's works brought her little fame when she was alive. They did quickly become fashionable among opinion makers, most notably the Regency of the time. They received very few published reviews, but the ones that she did get, on the whole, were balanced and were short, and they were good. Other important early reviews of her work draw favorable comparisons between her and such greats as Homer and Shakespeare, and praise the dramatic qualities of her narrative. However, because Austen's novels failed to conform to romantic and Victorian expectations that quote, powerful emotion be authenticated by an egregious display of sound and color in the writing, 19th century critics and audiences generally preferred the works of Charles Dickens and George Eliot. So, although her novels were steady sellers in the first part of the 19th century, they were never bestsellers. She did have many admiring readers in the 19th century who considered themselves part of a literary elite, among them the writer Henry James. And he viewed his appreciation of Jane Austen as a mark of his cultural taste. Henry James referred to Austen several times in writing and socially with approval, and on one occasion he compared her with Cervantes as one of the fine painters of life. Then in 1869, James Edward Austen Lee, a nephew or a grandnephew, I think, published a memoir of Jane Austen and introduced Jane to a wider public as dear Aunt Jane, the respectable maiden aunt. This immediately, of course, spurred the reissue of Austen's novels in fancy illustrated editions, and collector sets quickly followed, and there was a popular Jane Austen mania in the 1880s that was known as Austenolatry. That's what they called it. Members of the literary elite, though, they reacted against this popularization. They reacted against Austenolatry, and they referred to themselves as Janeites. In order to distinguish themselves from the unwashed masses who did not properly appreciate her works. And to this day, there are people that consider themselves very serious Janeites. For example, Henry James, who had earlier compared her to Cervantes, responded very negatively to Austenolatry. And he described it as a, quote, a beguiled infatuation with Austen, a rising tide of public interest that exceeded Austen's intrinsic merit and interest. Sounds a little jealous to me, but I don't know. Then in the 1940s, there was the spurt of revisionist views that began to argue that she was a subversive writer, which is something that me as a scholar, not as a scholar, as just a fan, I believe. And these views did much to confirm her reputation amongst academics and scholars and critics. They agreed that her ability to combine irony and realism and satire, which is no mean feat, made her a superior author to many of her male contemporaries. And actually, she is one of the first, if not the first, novelist of the time that wrote in different voices for her characters. When you're reading a Jane Austen novel, you can tell distinctly who is speaking at every moment in each chapter, and each character has a very specific and strong want or need. She was the first to do that. It's amazing. In the period since World War II has seen more scholarship on Austen, using a diversity of critical approaches, including, of course, feminist theory, and something called post-colonial theory, which I had to go and research a little bit. I didn't know. And like I said, I'm not a scholar. I just love her work. But I don't think she ever dreamt that her work would be used to analyze and explain and respond to the cultural legacies of colonialism and imperialism around the world. But there are those who contend that that is exactly what Jane Austen was doing. Sequels, prequels, and adaptations of almost every sort have been based on the novels of Jane Austen, from murder mysteries, Death Comes to Pemberley, to softcore pornography, Nights at Pemberley, to sci-fi fantasy and horror, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, Sense and Sensibility, and Sea Monsters. Which are very popular right now. It started happening. Beginning in the middle of the 19th century, the Austen family members published conclusions to her incomplete novels, and by the year 2000, there were over 100 printed adaptations of her work. The first film adaptation was the 1940 MGM production of Pride and Prejudice, starring Laurence Olivier and Greer Garson, which my mom loved. I did not, but she did. BBC television dramatizations, which were first produced in the 1970s, attempted to adhere meticulously to Austen's plots and characterizations and settings. They're so complicated. And then in 1995, a great wave of Austen adaptations began to appear, starting with Ang Lee's film of Sense and Sensibility, for which screenwriter and star of the movie, Emma Thompson, won an Academy Award. And of course, we have to mention the BBC's immensely popular TV miniseries, Pride and Prejudice, starring Colin Firth. Books and scripts that use the general storyline of Austen's novels but otherwise change or modernize the story have also become popular. At the end of the 20th century, it just exploded. Examples include Clueless, Amy Heckerling's adaptation of Emma, which takes place in Beverly Hills, and became a cultural phenomenon and spawned its own TV series. In 2004, Bride and Prejudice was a Bollywood-style adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, and is primarily filmed in English, but there is Hindi and Punjabi in it, and it's pretty amazing. In 2011, there was a film From Prada to Nada released, and it's about two spoiled Latina sisters in Beverly Hills who are left penniless after their father dies and are forced to go live with poor relations in East LA. Does it sound familiar? And I just saw something on Netflix the other day called Sense and Sensibility, but sense is spelled like sense, like a scent, so I'm sure there's perfume involved somehow. There's all kinds. There are also films that have been done that don't stick to her storylines, but borrow from her plots. 1998's You've Got Mail is loosely based on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and of course, again, Bridget Jones' Diary is based on Pride and Prejudice with Renee Zellweger and Colin Firth, who was specifically cast because he played Mr. Darcy in the BBC TV miniseries and made the whole wet shirt lake scene popular. If you haven't seen it, go see it. You will understand what I mean. So a tangent before I talk about Sense and Sensibility specifically. I mentioned earlier that Jane Austen's novels mocked the popular novels of sensibility of the time. So the sentimental novel, or the novel of sensibility, is an 18th century literary genre which celebrates the emotional and intellectual concepts of sentiment, sentimentalism, emotionality, or sensibility. Sentimental novels rely on emotional response from both their readers and the characters. They feature scenes of great distress and great tenderness, and the plot is arranged to advance emotions rather than action. Think of any Charles Dickens novel. It's something that continued throughout the 19th century. Charles Dickens relies on you to feel very deeply for his characters. There's nothing wrong with that. It's awesome. I love Charles Dickens. But Jane was kind of reacting against that. As a matter of fact, she references in her own novels, Northanger Abbey in particular, she references a Gothic novel of the time called The Mystery of Udolpho, which I've never read, but now I want to go read. And she is at once warning of the dangers of allowing yourself to be taken by the ideas of these Gothic novels. And at the same time, in chapter 2 of Northanger Abbey, she stops the story to defend novelists. She has a whole page and a half where she talks about why novelists are great. At the time, novelists were frowned upon. Only girls read novels. If you were a serious scholar, then you only read scholarly books. So she was doing two things at once. She was awesome. Sense and Sensibility, her first published novel, appeared in 1811 under the pseudonym A Lady. It's a work of romantic fiction, better known as a comedy of manners. It's set in southwest England, London, and Kent between 1792 and 1797. That's when she set it, because remember, she started writing it earlier. But costumes always reflect a little bit later, 1810, 1812, that era, and portrays the life and loves of the Dashwood sisters, Eleanor and Marianne. The novel follows the young ladies to their new home, a tiny cottage on a distant relative's property where they experience love, romance, and heartbreak. Sense in the book means good judgment, prudence, and sensibility, like the novels, means sensitivity or emotionality. Claire Tomlin, who's a Jane Austen biographer, argues that Sense and Sensibility has what she calls a wobble in its approach, which developed because Jane, in the course of writing the novel, gradually became less certain about whether sense or sensibility should triumph. Other scholars and other interpretations, however, argue that Austen's intention was not to debate the superior value of either sense or sensibility in good judgment, but rather to demonstrate that both are equally important and must be applied with good balance to one another. In doing research for this, I came across an essay called Speaking of Silence, Speech and Silence as a Subversive Means of Power in Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. It was written by Michael Beth Dinkler, who is a professor of English at Salem State College, and this is what she has to say about Sense and Sensibility. In A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf contends that 19th century society rejected women writers out of fear, which manifested itself in a conflict of values. This is an important book, the critic assumes, because it deals with war. This is an insignificant book because it deals with the feelings of women in a drawing room. Jane Austen's novels actually bring those gender stereotypes together by depicting the seemingly innocuous drawing room as a dangerous domestic battleground in itself. Without social or political power, Austen's only weapon in the battle for influence was her profoundly persuasive tongue. Thus, Austen's novels are preoccupied with a strategic play between spoken language and silence as a subversive means of power for the 18th century woman. As you will see in Sense and Sensibility, Austen highlights human strengths and weaknesses through the use of speech and silence as a site for contesting power relations. As we learn from Eleanor, in the domestic battleground of the drawing room, even those without the traditionally male artillery can win the war when they manage the weapons they have with greater cunning. So why is Dallas Theater Center doing Sense and Sensibility right now? So aside from our commitment to bringing literary classics to life on stage, I went to speak with our director, Sarah Rasmussen, who's pretty brilliant, and this is what she had to say about it, and I haven't changed her notes because they're pretty great. As a director, I began by asking, why are we telling this story now? This is particularly important with a classic story. I'm not interested in museum theater. I think if one wants to see the past reenacted in complete historical detail, we can turn on the BBC. I want to create a theater that gets to a deeper heart of why a story is retold over time and why it's important to tell again. Why Sense and Sensibility right now came with this brand new adaptation. This is brand new, so that's exciting, yay. Playwright Kate Hamill has skillfully captured the subversive wit and sincere heart of Austen. She also balances the high-stakes financial plight of the Dashwood sisters against the absurdity of the society that surrounds them. In Austen's society, there is a very real cost to Eleanor following all of the rules, and a very real cost to Marianne breaking all of the rules. And although much has changed, there is still a cost today to either following or breaking all of the societal norms. The gossip mill of Regency England could build or destroy your reputation. And so can our modern day Twitter accounts and Facebook feeds. It's amazing when I hear the things that Eleanor, the advice that Eleanor has for her sister Marianne. It's things that I heard my mother say to me as a teenage girl. So not a lot has changed, in my opinion. That complexity is at the heart of Austen's tale. And I think it's the reason that her stories still speak to us today. When it comes to romance, her heroines follow what they think will make them happy, instead of what others tell them will make them happy. Through trial and error, awkwardness, and grace, they hold out for a love that sees them in all of their flawed, endearing complexity. And in doing so, they find a partner that is an equal. That's what makes her subversive, in my opinion. And that's a story that transcends time and can still lift our hearts today. And so with those final thoughts, I'm going to leave you now and go finish getting dressed. I hope you enjoy Sense and Sensibility and that you'll stay for the talk back afterwards, where you'll get to talk with some members of the cast. Thank you very much.